January 17, 1945, the Ardennes forest, Belgium. The snow fell in silence, thick, heavy flakes that blanketed the shattered pines and smothered the frozen corpses half buried in the drifts. It was the kind of cold that turned breath into ice crystals before they left a man's lips, the kind that made steel burn to touch and turned blood black before it soaked into the ground. In a foxhole carved into the hillside near the village of Hoffelise, a young Wehrmacht corporal named Dieter Hoffmann huddled against the frozen earth, his fingers wrapped around a tin cup of ersatz coffee that had long since gone cold. Around him, his comrades whispered in the darkness, not with fear, but with something closer to bitter amusement. They had heard the reports from the forward observers. The Americans were coming. Patton's Third Army, driving north through the snow and the chaos, pushing toward the bulge that Wacht am Rhein had carved into the Allied lines. And the Germans, veterans of Stalingrad and Kursk, men who had survived the grinding hell of the Eastern Front, found this almost laughable. Patton, someone muttered in the dark, and the name carried with it a kind of theatrical scorn. They had read about him in the propaganda sheets, the cowboy general, the man with the pearl-handled pistols and the reputation for swagger. The German high command had circulated intelligence reports painting him as reckless, a glory seeker whose aggression would be his undoing in the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes. Hoffmann himself had heard the stories from prisoners taken in earlier skirmishes. American soldiers complaining about cold rations, about the lack of winter gear, about commanders who pushed too hard too fast. It fit the narrative that had been drilled into every German soldier since the beginning of the war, that Americans were soft, that their wealth had made them weak, that when faced with real hardship, real winter, real war, they would crumble like France had crumbled, like so many others had crumbled before the disciplined fury of the Wehrmacht. The laughter in that foxhole was quiet, but it was real. These men had endured winters that turned the Russian steppe into a white hell. They had seen entire divisions frozen in their tracks, had watched horses collapse and tanks seize up in cold so profound it shattered metal. If they could survive that, what could Patton's pampered Americans possibly do to them here, in these woods, where the Germans held the high ground and knew every trail, every approach, every killing field? What Dieter Hoffmann did not know, what none of them knew, huddled in their positions across the salient, was that George S. Patton had already done the impossible.
On December 16, 1944, when the Wehrmacht launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive that history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge, the German plan had been audacious to the point of desperation. Hitler himself had conceived it as a last gamble, a massive armored thrust through the weakly defended Ardennes, cutting through to Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies and forcing a negotiated peace in the west that would allow Germany to concentrate all its remaining strength against the Soviets in the east. For the first 72 hours, it had worked. 3 German armies, more than 200,000 men, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, smashed through the American lines. Entire regiments were surrounded. The 106th Infantry Division, green and inexperienced, surrendered by the thousands. Panic rippled through the Allied command structure. The weather turned savage. Fog and snow grounded the Allied air forces, negating the one advantage the Americans had counted on absolutely. In the chaos, German commandos in American uniforms sowed confusion behind the lines, and the roads became clogged with retreating vehicles and desperate refugees. By December 19th, the situation was critical. The vital road junction at Bastogne was surrounded, and if it fell, the Germans would have a clear path to the Meuse River. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding Allied ground forces in the north, recommended a strategic withdrawal to consolidate defensive positions, a prudent, cautious response to a crisis. But George Patton, commanding the Third Army to the south, had proposed something that every other general in the room considered impossible. He would disengage his entire army from its current offensive in the Saar, wheel it 90 degrees to the north, and attack into the flank of the German penetration, not in a week, not in 5 days, but in 48 hours. The silence that followed Patton's declaration at the emergency conference in Verdun has been documented by multiple witnesses. General Omar Bradley, his immediate superior, thought at first that Patton was joking. British officers exchanged glances that mixed skepticism with something approaching contempt. Even Dwight Eisenhower, who knew Patton's capabilities better than anyone, asked him if he truly understood what he was proposing. To wheel an entire army, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces, supply columns, 90 degrees in the middle of winter, on icy roads, through some of the most difficult terrain in Europe, and then immediately throw them into combat against prepared German positions, would require logistical coordination and staff work that should take weeks to plan. Patton was proposing to do it in 2 days. "I've already alerted my staff," Patton had replied, his voice carrying that peculiar mixture of supreme confidence and barely contained fury that characterized him. "I can attack with 3 divisions on December 22. He was not exaggerating. Before leaving for the conference, Patton had already set the wheels in motion, gambling that Eisenhower would give him the mission. His staff had prepared 3 separate attack plans, each corresponding to a different sector of the German Bulge. All that remained was for Patton to make a single phone call giving the code word, and the entire vast machinery of the Third Army would shift north. What followed was a feat of military logistics that remains studied in staff colleges to this day. In the midst of the worst winter Europe had seen in decades, with roads barely passable and visibility near zero, Patton's Third Army executed what military historians now call one of the most remarkable maneuvers in the history of warfare. The 4th Armored Division led the way, followed by the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions. Behind them came the supporting elements, artillery battalions, engineer companies, supply trucks laden with ammunition and fuel, medical units, headquarters elements, a river of men and machines 50 miles long, flowing north through the night. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice coated every surface. Vehicles skidded off roads into ditches, but recovery teams were already in position, pulling them out and pushing them forward. Soldiers marched through snow that came up to their knees, their faces raw with cold, their fingers numb inside their gloves, and they kept moving. By the morning of December 22, exactly as Patton had promised, 3 divisions of the Third Army slammed into the southern shoulder of the German Bulge.
In the German positions around Houffalize and along the approaches to Bastogne, the initial response was indeed something close to amusement. The forward observers reported American columns approaching, but the Wehrmacht Veterans were confident. They had faced Soviet winter offensives. They had constructed defensive positions designed to channel any attack into predetermined kill zones. They had Panzerfausts and machine guns sighted on every approach, and they were dug into positions that would require artillery preparation and coordinated assaults to dislodge. The Americans, rushing north in this weather, would be disorganized, exhausted, low on supplies. The German commanders expected a probing attack, perhaps a desperate attempt to relieve Bastogne that could be beaten back with acceptable losses. What they got instead was a sledgehammer wrapped in an American flag. The 4th Armored Division, under the command of Major General Hugh Gaffey, hit the German lines with a fury that shocked even hardened Eastern Front veterans. These were not the disorganized Americans of the first days of the offensive. These were men who had been fighting their way across France since Normandy, who had taken city after city, who had developed a combined arms doctrine that merged infantry, armor, artillery, and air support into a seamless killing machine. And behind them came the full weight of American industrial might, a weight the Germans, strangling under the Allied bombing campaign, could no longer match. The contrast was not merely numerical, it was philosophical, economic, existential. Every German soldier in the Ardennes that winter carried with him the material evidence and a Reich that was dying by degrees. Their uniforms were increasingly ersatz, wool mixed with rayon and wood pulp, boots with paper soles, greatcoats that had been recycled from captured stocks or civilian clothing. Their rations had shrunk to a daily allocation that would have been considered semi-starvation in any previous war. Dark bread made from sawdust and potatoes, a thin soup with fragments of horse meat if they were lucky, ersatz coffee that tasted like burnt acorns. The cigarettes they smoked were harsh mixtures of tobacco stems and leaves swept from factory floors. Their tanks, the mighty Panthers and Tigers, were mechanical masterpieces that broke down constantly for lack of spare parts and proper lubricants. Many units were issued bicycles instead of trucks. Fuel was so scarce that entire panzer divisions sat immobile, conserved for a final offensive that was already unfolding and already doomed. The Americans who came north with Patton carried a different reality. Private First Class Robert Hendricks of the 80th Infantry Division, a farm boy from Iowa, would later recall the strange cognitive dissonance of that winter campaign. He was miserable, the cold was ferocious, his feet were constantly wet, he hadn't slept more than a few hours at a stretch in days. But he was also, by any objective measure, better supplied than any soldier in human history to that point. His uniform was laminated cotton, water-resistant, designed by scientists who had studied hypothermia and frostbite. His boots were leather and rubber, insulated. He had wool socks, wool underwear, a wool shirt, and a wool overcoat. He had gloves with trigger fingers. He carried a first aid kit with sulfa powder and morphine. His weapon was an M1 Garand, semi-automatic, fed by 8-round clips that gave him a rate of fire a German soldier with a bolt-action Kar 98K couldn't match. In his pack he carried K-rations, canned meat, crackers, candy, cigarettes, instant coffee, toilet paper. He considered them barely edible, complained about them constantly, and would have been astonished to learn that a German soldier would have regarded them as a feast. This was the symbolism that would echo through the Ardennes, the material reality that would translate into combat effectiveness, the chocolate bar.
In the archives of the National World War II Museum, there are testimonies from German prisoners taken during the Battle of the Bulge that return again and again to this single object. A Wehrmacht sergeant captured near Bastogne on December 26th described being offered a Hershey bar by his American captors. He had not tasted real chocolate in more than 2 years. The fact that the Americans had so much of it, that they issued it as standard rations, that they seemed almost indifferent to it, offering it casually to prisoners, shook something fundamental in his understanding of the war. If the Americans could afford to give chocolate to their enemies while fighting in the middle of winter in a desperate battle, what else could they afford? What couldn't they afford? The answer was becoming brutally clear with every hour that Patton's army pushed north.
The weather began to clear on December 23rd. It was the break Patton had been praying for, literally praying for. In one of the war's stranger footnotes, Patton had ordered his Third Army chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, to compose a prayer for good weather. O'Neill had produced a brief text asking the Almighty to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend and grant fair weather for battle. Patton had ordered it printed on wallet-sized cards and distributed to every man in the Third Army, 250,000 copies. Whether through divine intervention or the ordinary fluctuations of European weather systems, the skies cleared. And with the clearing came the full fury of American air power. The 9th Air Force, equipped with P-47 Thunderbolts, launched from bases in France and fell upon the German columns with a vengeance that had been building through days of enforced inactivity. The P-47 was a beast of an aircraft, 7 tons of radial engine and armor plate, carrying bombs, rockets, and 8 50-caliber machine guns. Its pilots had spent months perfecting close air support, learning to work with ground controllers, striking targets within hundreds of yards of friendly forces. Now they ranged across the snowbound landscape, hunting for any vehicle, any troop concentration, any sign of German movement. They found plenty. The roads leading to and from the Bulge were choked with German columns that had nowhere to hide, and the Thunderbolts tore them apart. Fuel trucks exploded in fireballs that melted the snow for dozens of yards around. Troop carriers were shredded, their occupants cut down as they tried to flee across open fields. Tanks, which had seemed invincible to the infantry huddled in foxholes, brewed up under rocket fire, their turrets blown off, their ammunition cooking off for hours afterward. German soldiers who survived these attacks spoke of them with a kind of traumatized incomprehension. One lieutenant, captured near Wiltz, described watching a column of trucks destroyed in less than 5 minutes. They came from nowhere, he told his interrogators. One moment the road was clear, the next there were aircraft everywhere. We shot at them, but they didn't seem to care. They just kept coming, one after another, and when they left, there was nothing but fire and bodies. He paused, then added something that the interrogation report recorded verbatim. We knew you had many planes, but to see them, to feel what it means, it was like being hunted by gods. On the ground, Patton's divisions pressed forward with a relentlessness that owed everything to American logistics and nothing to mercy. The 4th Armored, spearheaded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams's 37th Tank Battalion, smashed through successive German defensive lines, losing tanks and men, but always replacing them, always continuing. When a Sherman was knocked out, another moved up to take its place. When a company took 50% casualties, it was reinforced and thrown back into the fight. The artillery never stopped firing. Every German position that revealed itself was immediately bracketed by shells from 105 and 155 mm howitzers that had ammunition to burn, literally to burn. American artillery doctrine in World War II was built on the premise of overwhelming firepower. Where the Germans calculated their bombardments in shells per gun, the Americans calculated theirs in tons per target. A typical German infantry division in the Ardennes had perhaps 40 artillery pieces and was rationed to a few hundred shells per day. An American division had more than 70 artillery pieces and could, if the tactical situation warranted, fire thousands of shells in an hour. The German soldiers experiencing this onslaught began to understand that they were not fighting an army, they were fighting an economy.
On December 26th, the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne. The siege was lifted. The men of the 101st Airborne Division, who had held the town against impossible odds for more than a week, watched as the Shermans rolled in, and the relief was tempered by a mutual respect that bordered on awe. The paratroopers had held with almost nothing, low on ammunition, out of medical supplies, eating frozen K-rations and melted snow, but they had held. The tankers had driven through a blizzard and through the heart of the German army to reach them. Both groups recognized in each other a kind of terrible competence, the product of a military system that could train millions of civilians and turn them into soldiers who would do things that seemed impossible because no one had told them it couldn't be done. For the Germans, the relief of Bastogne was the moment when Operation Walked on Rhine died, though the fighting would continue for weeks more. The Americans were not supposed to be able to do what they had just done. The weather was not supposed to clear in time. Patton's army was not supposed to disengage and redeploy that fast. The paratroopers were not supposed to hold without relief. None of it was supposed to happen, and yet it had. And now the German armies in the Bulge were in a salient that was rapidly becoming a trap. The snow that had been white on December 16th was red by January.
The killing intensified as Patton's forces, now reinforced by additional divisions, began to compress the Bulge from the south, while Montgomery's forces pressed from the north. The German retreat became a rout. Units that had advanced with confidence found themselves cut off, surrounded, annihilated. The Luftwaffe, which had made a brief appearance during the opening days of the offensive, vanished from the skies, shot down, destroyed on the ground, or grounded for lack of fuel. German soldiers abandoned their vehicles and fled on foot through the snow, harried by American artillery and American aircraft and American infantry that seemed to materialize from every direction. In the village of Houffalize, where Dieter Hoffmann had huddled in his foxhole and laughed at the thought of Patton's army, the Americans arrived on January 16th. By then, Hoffmann was dead, killed by a white phosphorus shell that had turned his position into an inferno from which there was no escape. His comrades, those who survived, surrendered with a kind of numb resignation. They were searched, disarmed, and marched to the rear through snow that was trampled black and red. As they walked, they passed American supply columns still moving forward, trucks laden with ammunition crates, fuel cans, food containers, winter clothing. One prisoner, a sergeant who had fought at Stalingrad, stopped and stared at a truck piled high with ration boxes. An American MP, noticing his expression, tossed him a K-ration. The sergeant caught it reflexively, looked down at it, and began to cry. Not from gratitude, from comprehension. He had spent 3 years watching the Wehrmacht bleed itself white against enemies who could always find more men, more guns, more supplies. He had believed that German discipline and German fighting spirit would be enough. He understood now that it had never been enough, could never have been enough. You could not defeat an enemy who could afford to wrap food in individual waxed paper packages and hand them out by the millions. You could not defeat an enemy who flew aircraft across an ocean just to train pilots, who built tanks so quickly that losing them was an acceptable cost, who could move an entire army 100 miles in 2 days because the logistics table said it was possible. The sergeant ate the K-ration, crackers and processed cheese, and a tiny bar of chocolate, and it tasted like defeat.
The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, when American forces restored the original front line. The cost had been staggering. American casualties exceeded 80,000, 19,000 dead, 47,000 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing. It was the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States Army in World War II. But German losses were catastrophic in a way that American losses were not. Germany lost more than 100,000 men, killed or captured, including some of its most experienced and capable troops. It lost hundreds of tanks and assault guns that could not be replaced. It burned through fuel reserves that represented a significant fraction of its remaining stocks. And it lost something less tangible but equally irreplaceable: the belief held by many German soldiers even in late 1944 that superior training and superior will could offset material disadvantage. Patton's relief of Bastogne became, in the mythology of the war, one of those hinge moments where perception and reality merged. The perception was that Patton, through force of personality and tactical brilliance, had saved the American army from disaster. The reality was more complex and, in its way, more impressive. Patton's personality mattered, his absolute refusal to accept excuses, his ability to inspire and terrorize his subordinates in equal measure, his instinctive understanding of tempo in combat. But the relief of Bastogne was ultimately the product of systemic excellence. It was the staff officers who had planned 3 different operations in advance. It was the quartermasters who had positioned fuel dumps along the probable routes of advance. It was the military police who kept traffic flowing on icy roads in the dark. It was the mechanics who kept vehicles running in temperatures that froze oil to sludge. It was the communication specialists who kept units in contact despite radio conditions that should have made coordination impossible. It was 10,000 small decisions and competencies replicated across an entire army that allowed an impossibility to become an accomplished fact.
The Germans, who prided themselves on staff work and military professionalism, recognized this even as it destroyed them. In the interrogation reports and the memoirs written after the war, there is a recurring theme: shock at the depth and sophistication of American logistics. German officers trained in a system that valued operational art and tactical flexibility had assumed that Americans, with their reputation for industrial mass production and democratic indiscipline, would be clumsy in execution. What they found instead was an enemy that had systematized warfare to a degree the Wehrmacht had never achieved. The Americans had calculated the ammunition expenditure for every type of combat operation and built supply chains to match. They had designed vehicles for specific tactical purposes: tank destroyers, armored personnel carriers, self-propelled artillery, and produced them in quantities that made combined arms operations the default rather than the exception. They had created a replacement system that could funnel individual soldiers from training camps in the United States to specific units at the front in a matter of weeks. It was warfare as industrial process, and it was unstoppable.
In the weeks following the battle, as both sides regrouped and prepared for the final campaigns that would carry the war into Germany itself, the American Army conducted after-action assessments. One report, filed by a combat observer attached to the 4th Armored Division, included interviews with German prisoners. A recurring question was why the German soldiers, many of them veterans of years of combat, had seemed to lose cohesion and fighting spirit so quickly once the tide turned. The answers varied, but several prisoners returned to a similar point. One, a corporal who had fought in North Africa, Italy, and Russia before being sent to the Ardennes, tried to explain it through an analogy. "We knew you had more of everything," he said. "More tanks, more planes, more artillery. We knew this. But knowing it and feeling it are different. When your positions are shelled for an hour without stopping, when your counterattack is broken up by aircraft before it begins, when you are captured and given food better than what you fed yourself, that is when you understand. We were fighting a country that had not even fully mobilized. You were fighting us with a fraction of your power. If you had wanted to, you could have buried us." He was not wrong. In 1944, the United States was producing 40% of all the world's armaments. American factories were turning out a bomber every 63 minutes, a tank every 7 minutes. The Ford Motor Company alone was producing more war material than the entire Italian economy. And unlike Germany, which had mobilized its economy for total war to the point of societal collapse, the United States had done so while maintaining a civilian standard of living that was, by global standards of the time, extraordinarily high. Americans at home ate better during the war than they had during the Depression. Unemployment had vanished. Women had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers and were earning wages their mothers could never have imagined. The war had not impoverished America, it had enriched it, and the wealth showed up in the equipment carried by every soldier, the rations in every foxhole, the casual abundance that was as much a weapon as any rifle or tank. The chocolate bar, offered to a starving prisoner by a soldier who had a dozen more in his pack, was a strategic weapon. It was propaganda more effective than any poster, a demonstration of economic superiority more convincing than any speech. It said, "We can afford to be generous because we have already won."
By February 1945, the Third Army had crossed the German border and was driving toward the Rhine. Patton's reputation, already legendary, had achieved a kind of mythic status. To the American public, reading accounts of the relief of Bastogne in newspapers back home, he was the embodiment of American aggression and confidence, the general who had refused to be stopped by weather or terrain or the enemy. To his soldiers, he was a more complex figure, demanding, profane, utterly indifferent to anything except victory, but a man who delivered on his promises. He had said he would reach Bastogne in 3 days, and he had. In a war where so many things were uncertain, where so many operations failed or stalled, Patton's certainty was itself a weapon. To the Germans, he had become something else, the symbol of an American way of war that they had fatally underestimated. German intelligence had built a profile of Patton that emphasized his impetuousness, his tendency to outrun his supply lines, his need for personal glory. The profile was not entirely wrong. Patton was all of those things. But it had missed the essential point. Patton's aggression was not recklessness. It was the tactical expression of strategic abundance. He could afford to attack constantly because he knew the supplies would be there. He could afford to take risks because he knew losses could be replaced. He operated on the principle that speed and violence of action would save lives in the aggregate, and he was backed by an industrial and logistical system that made that principle viable. The Germans had no equivalent. When a German general attacked, he had to husband his resources, plan for contingencies, conserve strength for the inevitable counterattack. When Patton attacked, he spent resources like water because there was always more water. The clearest expression of this came in March when the Third Army reached the Rhine at Oppenheim, and Patton, without waiting for orders or for Montgomery's elaborately planned crossing to the north, simply threw his forces across the river in assault boats in the middle of the night.
By the time Eisenhower was informed, the Third Army had a bridgehead and was expanding it. Patton's message to headquarters was characteristically blunt. "Dear Ike, today I spat in the Rhine." It was a gesture of contempt, a middle finger to the enemy and to the cautious logistics of war. But it was a gesture only possible because behind Patton's spearheads were engineers building pontoon bridges, supply trucks carrying fuel and ammunition, reinforcements moving up to exploit the breakthrough. The gesture was theatrical. The system that enabled it was not.
The snow in the Ardennes melted in March, revealing the wreckage of the battle. Shattered vehicles, German and American, rusted in the fields. Unexploded ordnance, shells, mines, grenades littered the landscape, a deadly legacy that would kill Belgian farmers for decades. The forest, once pristine, was a wasteland of shattered trees and churned earth. In the villages, civilians emerged from cellars and began the slow process of rebuilding. And in the cemeteries, the graves multiplied, white crosses and stars of David in neat rows, markers for men who had died in the snow and the cold and the fire. For the soldiers who had fought there, both American and German, the Ardennes became a kind of reference point, a before and after in their understanding of the war and of themselves. For the Americans, it was validation. They had been tested against the Wehrmacht at its most desperate and most dangerous, and they had not merely survived, they had won. The narrative that they were soft, that they could not stand against the hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, had been burned away in the snow. For the Germans, it was the final disillusionment. The soldiers who survived and were captured told their interrogators variations of the same story. They had believed in victory, or at least in a negotiated peace, until the Ardennes. After the Ardennes, they believed only in survival. One German officer, a major who had commanded a Panzer Grenadier battalion, was asked by his interrogators what had surprised him most about the American army. He thought for a long time before answering. "The chocolate," he said finally. The interrogators thought he was being flippant and pressed him. He shook his head. "I am serious. We expected you to fight well because you had good equipment. We did not expect you to be so rich, not just in equipment but in everything, in food, in clothing, in the small things. One of my men was wounded and captured. When he was returned to us in a prison exchange, he told us that the American medics had given him fresh bandages every day. Every day. New bandages, thrown away after one use. We were washing our bandages and reusing them. He said the Americans seemed shocked that we did this, as if it was barbaric. Maybe it was, but we had no choice. You had choices. That is what we did not understand. You could afford to throw away bandages, to give chocolate to prisoners, to fire 1,000 shells where we would fire 10. You could afford to fight the way you fought. We could not. That was the difference. It was the difference. And it was the difference that had been forged not on the battlefields of the Ardennes, but in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, in the farms of Iowa and Kansas, in the offices of Washington where bureaucrats calculated production schedules and shipping tonnages. The Battle of the Bulge was won by the soldiers who fought in the snow, but it was made winnable by the workers who built the tanks, the farmers who grew the food, the scientists who designed the equipment, the taxpayers who funded it all. It was a victory of systems over heroism, of abundance over sacrifice, of a society that could mobilize for total war without total mobilization.
In the years after the war, George S. Patton became a figure of controversy and legend in equal measure. He died in a car accident in Germany in December 1945, just months after the war's end, and his death froze him in time as the warrior general, the man who had driven his army across Europe with a fury that seemed almost personal. His flaws, his arrogance, his political naivete, his occasional cruelty were debated by historians and biographers. But among the soldiers who had served under him, there was a simpler consensus. He had told them he would reach Bastogne in 3 days, and he had reached Bastogne in 3 days. In a war of broken promises and failed offensives, that mattered. The Germans who had laughed at the thought of Patton's army coming north through the snow were mostly dead by the time the war ended. Some died in the Ardennes, cut down by artillery or aircraft or rifle fire. Some died in the subsequent campaigns, the drive across Germany, the last desperate stands in the Ruhr and around Berlin. Some survived to become prisoners, laboring in French coal mines or American prison camps, replaying the war in their minds and trying to understand where it had all gone wrong. In their testimonies, in the letters they wrote home, in the memoirs they published decades later, the Battle of the Bulge appeared as a turning point, the moment when the reality of American power, so long obscured by distance and propaganda, became undeniable. One veteran, writing in the 1970s, described his experience in the Ardennes with a kind of dark clarity. He had been a 20-year-old lieutenant in December 1944, full of faith in the Führer and in Germany's destiny. By February 1945, he was a prisoner, his battalion destroyed, his faith gone. "We laughed at Patton," he wrote.
We laughed at the Americans. We thought they were shopkeepers playing at war. We learned differently. They were shopkeepers who had built a war machine that could not be stopped. And when I think back to those days in the snow, what I remember most is not the fighting, but the moment after I was captured. An American soldier gave me a cigarette, a real cigarette, not the garbage we had been smoking, and I realized that I was relieved. Relieved to be out of it, relieved to be alive, relieved that I no longer had to pretend I believed we could win. That cigarette tasted like the end of the world, my world, and maybe it was.
The snow in the Ardennes is white again now, falling on forests that have regrown over the scars of war. The villages are rebuilt, prosperous, quiet. Tourists visit the battlefields, walking the trails where soldiers fought and died, reading the plaques that mark the locations of desperate stands and brutal attacks. In the American cemetery at Henri-Chapelle, thousands of white marble crosses march in perfect rows across the hillside, each one marking a man who did not come home. And in museums and archives, the artifacts of the battle are preserved: the weapons, the uniforms, the letters, the photographs. Among those artifacts, in a small museum in Bastogne, there is a glass case containing items recovered from the battlefield. There is a German helmet, rusted and dented. There is an American dog tag, the name worn almost smooth. There is a spent shell casing from an M1 Garand. And there is a small foil-wrapped rectangle, brown and fragile with age, marked with the words Hershey's Milk Chocolate, U.S. Army Ration. It sits there behind the glass, mundane and profound, a symbol of everything the battle meant and everything it proved. It is a reminder that wars are not won by the bravest soldiers or the most brilliant generals, though both matter. They are won by the societies that produce the chocolate bars, that can afford to give them away, that build economies so powerful that their abundance becomes a weapon as terrible as any bomb. The Germans laughed at Patton, laughed at the Americans, laughed at the idea that soft, wealthy, undisciplined democratic soldiers could stand against the hardened warriors of the Wehrmacht. And then the snow turned red, and the laughter stopped, and in the silence that followed there was only the sound of tanks rolling north, of artillery firing, of aircraft overhead, and of an army that had done the impossible because no one had told it that impossible meant anything. In the end, the chocolate bar was not just a ration, it was a promise. It said, "We have enough. Enough food, enough fuel, enough steel, enough men, enough will. We have enough to feed our soldiers, to supply our armies, to defeat our enemies, and to give candy to prisoners because we can afford the gesture." It was the promise of a nation that had turned its wealth into power, its industry into victory, and its abundance into the most devastating weapon of all, the certainty that it could not be outlasted, could not be outproduced, and in the frozen hell of the Ardennes in the winter of 1945, could not be stopped. The Germans had laughed, and then Patton's men came through the snow, and the laughter died in their throats, and the snow, pristine and white and silent, turned red with the blood of an empire that had bet everything on the belief that will could triumph over wealth, that spirit could defeat steel, that a nation starving itself for war could overcome a nation that fought without breaking stride. They were wrong. And in the wrongness of that belief, in the ruins of that wager, the shape of the post-war world was written. A world where American power, forged in the fires of the Ardennes and 100 other battles, would stand as the guarantor of a peace built not on empires or ideologies, but on the simple, overwhelming fact of abundance. The snow melted, the dead were buried, and the living went home carrying with them the memory of what had been proven in those frozen woods, that freedom, when backed by the wealth to sustain it and the will to defend it, could not be conquered. Not by winter, not by surprise, not by veterans of the Eastern Front, and not by any army on earth. The chocolate bar, small and brown and ordinary, had been the symbol of that truth. And for the Germans who survived to taste it, it had tasted like the end of everything they had believed.